Jonathan Blake from ADAS to come to the stage, and this is the big moment we've all been waiting for to see how our fungicides have been performing during the last season. And having a quick preview last night, looking through the presentation, there are some quite interesting observations. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Keith. Firstly, an apology to make for those of you in the room today. The handouts you've got in front of you contain most of the slides I'm about to share with you. We have, in an effort to give you the most up-to-date information, though, continued to edit and amend this right up until the last day or so well after the print deadline. But hopefully what you have in front of you will give you a good enough guide. The full presentation will be available on the AHDB website in due course. As Keith said, I'm going to cover wheat and barley. Actually, Faye Ritchie will come in and take over on oilseed rape a little bit later on. So, just to touch on wheat to start with. Personally, I think this is one of the most important pieces of work that AHDB do. It's exclusively funded by AHDB to provide you with the latest information on fungicide efficacy and changes in efficacy. And it's on both those two topics we'll be discussing today. And perhaps the place to start is by considering how we get that information. We have a number of sites across the country. Given the importance of septoria and septoria control to us all, the majority of those sites do focus on septoria. And we have a total of 5 sites, but 7 trials. 7 because Fife and SRUC do trials both at T1 and separately at T2 to check product efficacy in both those 2 timings. And we look at those over a number of different varieties. Those varieties are chosen to be highly susceptible to the target pathogen in each of the areas. It's not consistent across sites, doesn't need to be. We also look at yellow rust, brown rust, and fusarium, and we're using reflection, Crusoe, and Grafton on those pathogens, which I'm sure you'll agree are suitable varieties to test on those pathogens. What data did we get from 2017? Well, if we look at 2017, we actually had very good protectant data from almost all of our septoria trial sites. One exception being Sutton Scotney, where we took up more brown rust than septoria. But that's been able to usefully add to the information we have. On curative side, it's always more difficult to get curative data out of these trials, but we do have 3 sites from 2017 that gave us good curative information as well. What products have we been testing? There's a number of products in here. Well, the priority for us is to test products with a single active ingredient. Then we can really see what those active ingredients are bringing. That allows us to provide the building blocks for spray programs. So that will always be the priority. There's a number in here, Bravo, Ignite, Proline, Imtrex, and Vertizone. We've had them in there as standards for a few years now. That's both to check on their efficacy now, but also to see how they may be changing over time. And we'll come on to that a little later. We do have 3 SDHI azole mixtures that we've been testing this year. Latus, Librax, and Ascara. You might say, where's Aviator, where's Dexar? We've been testing those for many years. We know how those perform. We are limited for space within these trials, so we've decided to go with the chemistry we know less about. But that doesn't necessarily mean those aren't perfectly good SDHI azoles to be using. A little bit on the background of the project and where we position these trials. I know many of you will be familiar with how these trials are run, but we choose our sites to maximize disease pressure. So, unsurprisingly, the septoria trials are generally further west. Higher rainfall tends to mean we have higher pressure in those areas. And so we have 2 in Scotland, 2 down in Hampshire, and 1 in Herefordshire, 1 over in Cardigan, and 1 over with the Republic of Ireland. That's funded through the Irish government and managed by Chuggers. On yellow rust, that yellow star seems to have stretched a little bit from the Wash where it's actually based. That's actually ADAS Terrington, which is well known to be a hotbed of yellow rust activity. Cambridge is the brown rust star, and tend to find more brown rust further south, and that's been quite good. We inoculate that trial as well to ensure we get good levels of brown rust within it. Fusarium just happens to be based where we have a focus on fusarium work on irrigated land near Nottingham. So that's the locations. What do we actually do to generate the information? Well, having found those high-risk situations on those susceptible varieties, we spray the trials just once. So it's a pretty extreme test. We spray them once either with a quarter, half, full, or double label rate. And then we look to see what activity we have, both on the leaves that were just emerged at the point of spraying and emerging, and on those leaves we find protectant information. Where the leaves have been out for a little while prior to the spray being applied, the disease has usually had a chance to build up on those disease. It may be latent in those leaves. It's on those leaves that we look for curative information. So that just gives you a bit of an overview for those of you that aren't so familiar with this work. I mentioned Alatus era because when we met here last, Alatus era was not registered. It came out in January of 2017, so it seems fair just to give it a mention. This is a new SDHI in benzovindi flupire, more regularly called solatenol, and it's a combination of that with prothioconazole. And in a full label rate of this, you have 150 grams of prothioconazole, which is a 3/4 dose of prothioconazole compared to what you get in Proline. Full label rate of a litre, you can only use it once, and its use is not restricted just to wheat and barley. And we've been testing it in these trials since 2016, so we have 2 years' data on that now. Let's start by looking at some of the curves. This is the Septoria protectant data from 2017. On the right-hand side, you have the curves for the products with a single active ingredient. On the left, you have the mixtures. You can compare left to right. It's the same total data set. We just separate them so that you can see the curves. It becomes too difficult to see what's going on otherwise. On the right-hand side, you can clearly see the products tested fall into two categories, the azoles and the STHIs. And actually, in 2017, both Ignite and Proline, epoxy and prothioconazole, performed very similarly in protectant situations. That's a slight change from what we saw in 2016 and 17, where it seemed that prothioconazole was looking slightly stronger in those in this test. Reassuringly, across the average, across all sites here, Imtrex and Vertizan are still providing us with a higher level of performance than that. With Vertizan, dose for dose, not quite as effective as Imtrex, and that's something that we've seen for a number of years, so no changes in that comparison. Note, Bravo is present within these trials as a single point. We test that just at a litre rate, the half-label rate of Bravo, and that's in there as a little red star above the 50% mark. And you can see Bravo in a protectant situation here is providing us with something in the order of 50% control. Actually, it's providing slightly more control than a full label rate of either Ignite or Proline here, which is interesting. So clearly, prothioconazole is a very important part of protecting ourselves against Septoria. Or perhaps our crops rather than ourselves. In terms of mixtures, on the left-hand side now, all three of those mixtures performed very well. And probably on that data set, it's not actually possible to pull out differences between them. They were all looking very similar at a full label rate. I have included, and you won't have this in your handouts, the 2015 to 17 curves, and that's what we have here. Broadly, it's very similar to what we've just described. The only perhaps difference is that when you include the other two seasons, prothioconazole does look a little bit stronger than epoxy on the right-hand side. And you might just separate out the SDHI mixtures in that when we look across 3 years, we can include Aviator, because that was present in 2 of the 3 seasons. We actually combine the data by a reminal analysis. It's not just a straight average, I should add. So it is a reasonably fair comparison to do. It's a reasonable way of combining years where we don't have a complete data set. And you can just see, I think, it looks a little like Aviator isn't quite as strong as Ascara, and that looks like the fluoroparam addition 2 aviator that makes up Ascara is adding something in terms of protectant activity, but with the other 2 sitting pretty well in between there. Looking at curative activity from 2017, this is from the 3 sites we discussed. On the right-hand side, prothioconazole did look a little bit stronger than epoxy at the higher rates. The comparison between Vertizan and Imtrex was very similar to what we saw in the protectant situation. On the left-hand side, clearly the mixtures Latus and Ascara performed very similarly, but actually last year, Librax really came out very well and did appear to separate itself. It provided a very good level of performance in 2017. When we look across 3 years, a very similar picture on the right-hand side to what we've just described, but on the left-hand side, I think it's fair to say that Librax result is heavily influenced by that 2017 data. I should add, actually, in 2017, Librax, that effect was consistent across all sites, but it doesn't seem to be consistent across the seasons. Actually, in 2015 and 16, we'd have said Librax was very close to the rest of the group. So it seems to be a seasonal effect which has pulled that out. The other SDHI mixtures looking very similar in terms of curative activity. In terms of yield, we look at yield, and we've got to be a little bit careful looking at yield from these trials when we remember that it is a single spray application that's been allowed to let run. So it's a pretty extreme test of persistence, it's fair to say. But broadly, it reflects the disease control we've seen in both the curative and protectant data. On the left-hand side, again, the rank order of the products actually is different from what we've just seen. Actually, Latus comes out a little bit better, perhaps, than the others in terms of adding more persistence. But broadly, probably quite hard to separate them based on that information. And when we look across years, again, slightly different rank order. I think it probably reflects the fact that we probably struggle to separate the yields on the left-hand side between the mixtures, other than perhaps, again, to say, it looks like Ascara is performing a little bit better than Aviator. It's adding a little bit more to yield due to that addition of that fluoroparam. With the rest falling somewhere in the middle, it's probably hard to say, probably difficult to say whether or not those are actually significantly different. So that was that on Septoria. We'll come back, talk a little bit more about the SDHIs in a little while. But just to cover the ground for the 2017 data, we touch on rusts. Actually, it was a tough season for testing against yellow rust last year. We had sprays applied in early May and some very hot, dry weather at the end of May and into June, which tended to check yellow rust development. However, that very same weather promoted brown rust, so what we gain with one hand, we take with the other. But one thing that is worth saying is the top photo in the right-hand corner there is one that I took 3 weeks ago in a crop in Lincolnshire. I wasn't even looking for yellow rust, but it was there. This variety is rated 8 for yellow rust. It's out there at the moment. I found brown rust in the same crop, which was slightly disturbing. But I think, actually, probably we needn't worry about yellow and brown rust in crops at this time of year. Generally, if we have a good period of cold, hard weather, that will check that sufficiently and may even remove it altogether from that crop. If it does stay mild, though, that's one to watch. And we did see, I think it's 10 years ago now, in 2007, we had temperatures 2 or 3 degrees above average all winter, and we had brown rust in most crops come spring, and that turned into an epidemic that was very hard to control. So it's one just to watch if it does stay mild over the next 2 or 3 months. A lot of varieties susceptible, though, and what activity are we seeing? Well, where we inoculate, we do create a fairly extreme test, and where conditions as well favour brown rust, it turns into an even tougher test for some products. This really managed to pull apart products in the extreme. We assessed both 3 and 6 weeks after spray application, having effectively a brown rust epidemic up and running. And it's probably a bit tough on Proline to see it looking like that. Clearly it does have efficacy and probably look better after 3 weeks than it did after 6, but that's the average as it comes out. We have quite a limited number of products within this, but we're keen to identify what the actives are bringing. And Caramba we kept in there because it's widely used in Librax. and we wanted to see what that brings on brown rust activity. And it and Vertizan performed quite similarly, but one product that really stood out was Alatus. Well, Alatus is a mixture with prothioconazole, and Prothio itself wasn't doing a great deal within this work. So it clearly suggests that benzovindiflupyr or solatinol is highly active on brown rust and was able to control it even with a quarter or half dose. So that does seem to be a very good active on brown rust control. And it came through in the yields in just the same way. On yellow rust, as I said, it's a tough season on yellow rust. Actually, it was quite hard to separate products because effectively we applied our products, they controlled the disease, and then the weather controlled the disease as well. But we did pull apart some differences. Certainly the untreated was a lot worse than the rest, but most products were performing very similarly at point of assessment and providing around about 50% control. I think you can pull out on the right-hand side that the benefit that we often see with epoxyconazole. Epoxy is very strong on yellow rust, and anything with that tends to perform very well. Actually, I'm going to look at the 3-year mean now, because I think that's probably more valuable. And when we look across 3 years, on the right-hand side, you see the benefit of epoxy. We've got epoxy and Comet in there as the lead actives of their group. Epoxy is thought to be the strongest azole. I think Cipro and Teb are probably very similar, but Comet as well is thought to be the lead QOI on yellow rust control. And we always do think of Comet as a little bit weaker than Ignite or epoxyconazole on yellow rust. It's never quite as strong. And I think it's fair to say other QOIs are probably not quite as strong as Comet. So bear that in mind if you're looking to use QOIs to control yellow rust early in the season. It may not perform quite as well as an azole. There may be good reasons for not applying azoles, but we just need to be cautious of using strobilurins, especially where yellow rust is already active. The SDHIs in Vertizan and Imtrex were tested as solos within this, and they will add to the amount of yellow rust activity. That they're not in themselves, though, highly active on yellow rust. On the left-hand side, we have the mixtures, and again, it's clear products with epoxyconazole performed well. We have Keystone in there that contains epoxy. Most of those actually on the left-hand side actually don't contain epoxy. And again, actually, we saw it on brown rust. Alatus era again comes out quite well for a prothioconazole-based treatment there. When we look at yields, that comes out perhaps even clearer. As I said, this is a severe test of product persistence. This yellow rust trial goes from yellow to green in patches, back to yellow within the space of about 3 weeks. Some of these products may extend it to 4 weeks, and that's probably the difference we're seeing. And yeah, clearly Ignite performed very well on the right-hand side, the epoxyconazole-based mixture there. Epoxyconazole itself, solo. On the left-hand side, the mixtures, Keystone performed very well. We know isoparazine has some activity, but it's probably primarily the epoxyconazole in there that's doing the work. But again, Alatus era looked very strong on yellow rust within these trials. A little bit on fusarium. We have been continuing to test the 3 or 4 main azoles on fusarium to truly bottom out what their activity is. And this was the pattern we saw in 2017, which is fairly akin to what we've seen previously. Ignite, perhaps not quite as strong as Caramba and Folicure. Proline probably coming out a little bit better than other actives on fusarium. And we can do that by assessing head blight in the field, but we can also look at that in the laboratory. Sorry, this is the 3-year mean as well. The 3-year mean actually seems to be, the Proline line seems to be warped by the quarter dose. The points don't fit the curves perfectly for Proline, and I think I'd bear that in mind when you're considering what rate to use. We actually probably think it's safer to use a half or a 3/4 dose of prothioconazole to control fusarium, and that is perhaps a bit misleading in that respect. But it's interesting how well Ignite has performed. We wouldn't have expected epoxyconazole to be as good as what it appears to be here, and it does appear to be reasonably active. We can look at the head blight on the ear, but we can also look at the grains and actually send those grains away for analysis. and we can look at mycotoxins or deoxynivalenol or DON to see how well those treatments have actually worked. And this is looking at the full dose rates of each of the products. And actually, where we've tested this over the last 3 years, the average figures show the untreated, where we've inoculated and misted, actually had about 2.5 times the maximum legal limit for DON for human consumption. So clearly by misting, we do create a very significant level of disease, one that precludes that seed from being used for human consumption. Reassuringly, though, in that severe test, all of the azoles we applied managed to bring that level down below that maximum legal limit. We can look at that as DON, or we can look at it as fusarium DNA. The rank order is very similar. Interestingly, again, with DON, proline probably comes out ahead of Ignite there, and Caramba and Foliar somewhere in between. The rank order does change slightly with the fusarium, but it's probably within the level of variation that we would expect within this, and there's a good set of information on that basis. I wanted to talk a little bit about declines in activity, because we use this information both to look at the most up-to-date efficacy information, but it's also instructive to look back and see how things are changing over time. And I'm sure many of you are fairly familiar with this chart because we've been updating it year after year for about the last 4 or 5 years. We have obviously added the 2017, but I wanted to draw your attention to one aspect of this. I'm not sure the straight line decline is still appropriate to be used here. It looks like it fits the data very well, and it probably will continue to for a while. But actually in the last 4 or so years, in a protectant situation on the left-hand side, you'd say broadly, we're not seeing huge changes. Around 50% control, or there or thereabouts. And in curative situations, you'd have to say since about 2012, 13, we're seeing broadly the same amount of control there too, about 20 to 40% control. This is a huge shift from where we were previously, obviously, but it does suggest we might be in a situation where we're not seeing rapid changes in azole sensitivity now, and that was possibly through the more broad use of SDHIs and multi-sites, we're not seeing that population. It seems to have stabilized at a lower level in that respect. We've also been tracking Imtrex and Vertizan and seeing how they're performing over time. And when we look at Imtrex, and this effectively just compares each year that we've had it in trials since 2013. So each chart is a separate year. The bold line here represents the mean percent control. So all these curves are effectively upside down. Higher is better suddenly. And the bold line represents the mean. The dotted lines represent the highest and lowest seen within each season. And I think there's 2 things going on here. Firstly, I think there's a gentle decline in the highest point reached by each of those curves. I think there's also a change in the shape of those curves. The sharp shoulder seems to disappear between 2013 and 2017, such that the half and quarter rates in 2013 may have been providing us with around 90% control on average. Now, that's probably nearer 50 to 70% control. So we do think that the lower rates seem to be less effective, and to achieve similar levels of control to what we've had previously may require us to increase our rate of SDHI. That's Imtrex. I should say this is an average across all sites. This is Vertizan, and both of these 2 SDHIs we've had since 2013, and it's a very similar pattern. A gentle decline in the highest amount of control achieved on average, but also a change in that shape of that curve, meaning we probably need to be applying a higher rate than we did previously to get the same level of control. And I guess one of the questions that comes out of that, and it's a fairly obvious question, is are we selecting for that insensitivity? And we've actually been looking at that within these trials. Following treatment applications, we've been taking samples from the plots where those treatments were applied and testing to see how insensitive or otherwise those isolates are. So just to explain one of these charts, each of these points represents an individual isolate of septoria. And the different lines within this represent the different treatments they were collected from. So the blue and the red line represent where no fungicide was applied or where Ignite was applied in 2017. And that just represents the population, and unsurprisingly, whether we applied Ignite or applied no fungicide, actually the sensitivity to SDHI was similar. So that's quite reassuring. It suggests that actually Ignite and azole isn't selecting for insensitivity to SDHIs. The obvious other line there is the green line. That's where we applied Imtrex. And clearly, where we applied Imtrex, the population has shifted to the right and become less sensitive to the SDHI that we used and tested in the laboratory. So we have seen a change. And if we look at the proportion of that chart that's changed, it's actually the top right-hand corner of the green curve there suggests it's something in the order of 20% of that population that is following the Imtrex treatment that is less sensitive than following the other treatments. We can look at it in a single season, but we can also look at it over seasons, and this data is courtesy of Rothamsted, where Bart Fry has been monitoring this for many years, and he's been looking at collecting field samples from around Rothamsted and putting them through a screen to see just how sensitive or otherwise the population is. And you'd have to say probably up until about 2015, there wasn't any huge changes in SDHI sensitivity. At the very top of the orange dots there, you can see a slight wobble in that curve that indicates a few isolates that were detected that were less sensitive in 2016, and the 2017 data clearly suggests something in the order of 20 or 30% of what was seen in 2017 at the start of the season this year was less sensitive than anything seen before 2015. So it does seem that there is a percentage of the population, the septoria population out there, that is now less sensitive than it was previously. And when we look across the water, and this information is courtesy of Stephen Kildare at Chuggas, and he's been monitoring this over there too, and they saw a big shift. They actually take their data at the end of the year rather than the start, so this is actually his 2017 line is provisional, he's still updating that. The 2016 line is from the end of that season, and they saw a big shift in 2016, and it seems to have shifted a little bit again since. So there are some sensitivity changes going on there, and we're seeing them both in the field and in the laboratory now. A little bit of information here that isn't on your handouts that we've drawn in from the first year of a 4-year project that AHDB are involved in, looking at resistance management and challenging our approaches to resistance management. You might think that a 4-year project that's just started looking at resistance management might be like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted, but actually this is very foresighted work looking to identify the best way to manage fungicides in the future to protect future modes of action. And we can use SDHIs as the template to see how we can select for insensitivity to that. And what I want to draw your attention to here is, the first bar on the left shows that where we do nothing, or where we did nothing in 2017, at 3 sites, the average level of mutant strains that was detected was around 20%. So that fits with what Bart was showing at Rothamsted. That's an average across 3 sites, and that is an average as well of a number of different mutant strains. They're listed along the bottom there. Some of them are considered moderately insensitive, some more insensitive than that. I want to draw your attention now to the 2nd and 4th bars along in that, because that compares where we used SDHIs once or where we used SDHIs twice within this set of 3 trials. And you can see where we used SDHIs once, the level of that mutant strain frequency increases to around 30%, and where we used them twice in the 4th bar along, it increased to 40% or just above. Additionally, if we look at the 4th and 5th bars here, we can see by adding a multi-site to that 2-SDHI program, we were able to ameliorate that effect a little bit. We were able to soften it and bring that mutant strain frequency down a little bit. But the biggest effect there is the addition of the second SDHI. So clearly, the more we use them, the quicker we will select for insensitivity. So just to sum up on wheat, it's clearly the SDHIs are still providing us with a good level of performance on septoria, but there is some evidence of a decline and some monitoring from laboratories that support that. Elatus, Librax, Ascara, very comparable for protection. We would say, though, Librax did look in 2017 stronger in terms of activity in a curative situation. We need to use the azoles and multi-sites to slow resistance development. That's something that's coming through, and I'm sure we will talk more about that a little bit later on this morning. On rusts, clearly epoxiconazole is still a lead azole in that area. Paraclostrobin shows very good activity too, especially on yellow rust. And the new SDHI, Elatus era, does appear to be a very strong SDHI on rust in its own right, on both yellow and brown. On fusarium, prothioconazole really leads. Metcon, Teb, and epoxy all pretty close behind as well. So that was that on wheat. We'll move on to look at barley briefly. Okay for time, Keith?
It's a very important section, so yeah.
Okay, well,
Crack on.
I'll crack on. In terms of trials and treatments, we'll get to treatments by looking at the curves, but the trials that we've been looking at primarily focused on Rhynchosporium and net blotch, with one trial on Ramularium, one on powdery mildew across the country. On Rhynchosporium, it's a fairly similar picture to what we've seen previously. Vertizan and Imtrex being the 2 SDHIs we've been testing, and Imtrex is clearly stronger. In fact, actually, there's 2 really strong actives in Rhynchosporium control that we've been testing, and that's Proline and Imtrex. And any mixture on the left-hand side, or all of those 3 mixtures on the left-hand side, rather, contain one or other of those active ingredients. So it's no surprise that they all look pretty strong and broadly comparable in terms of the efficacy that we see from them. Priaxor, for those of you that don't know, is a combination of Comet and Imtrex, and you've got both of those on the right-hand side, and it performs roughly how you might expect the addition of those two to perform. I mentioned Comet, and actually one thing we've picked up here is Comet doesn't seem to be providing as much control as it might have previously, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. When we look across 3 years, it's almost exactly the same picture. I've included this for completion more than anything else. The 3 mixtures looking very similar in terms of their control, and Imtrex and Proline, the key lead actives within those. Trial yields, again, tough test, and actually with barley trials, it's very rare that we have a pure stand of exactly one disease. So it's often the broad spectrum products that come out a little bit better in terms of yield, and that might explain why Siltra looks quite strong within the yields that we get out of these Rhynchosporium trials. On QOIs, though, I did want to just touch on what we're seeing. We have, unusually actually, usually the laboratories around Europe tell us when there's an insensitivity, and then we look for it in the field. In this instance, I'm not aware of any mechanism or mutation that's been referenced to, but when we track back the activity that we've seen within these trials of Comet, and we've been testing it since 2002, it used to perform a lot better than it seems to now. And now we're probably getting 30 to 50% control from a full label rate of it, where we used to get 70, 80, 90% control. So we do think there has been a change there, and it's possible in due course we may understand more about the mechanism of how that change has occurred. But if you are looking to control Rhynchosporium, I perhaps wouldn't rely entirely on a QOI to do it. It looks like there may be some insensitivity that has developed there. On Ramularia, I'll start by just giving what the previous position was on Ramularia. This was up to 2015. And up to that point, on the right-hand side, we had a number of products with a single mode of action that we were testing. We had Zulu, Intrex, and both of those performing quite well in terms of activity on Ramularia. Proline in there, also very active. It's hidden behind the Bravo line there, doing a good job on Ramularia. Bravo, again, also very active. The mixtures also performing very well. Bontima in there, as well as Ciprodinil plus isoparazam, Adexar and Siltra, all performing very well. So a range of products that were very capable of controlling Ramularia and barley. This is the situation now. Some of you will have heard the press releases from Bayer in April of 2017 that touched on the concerns that we had insensitivity to azoles and SDHIs in the Ramularia population. And that was primarily in Germany that they were referencing to. But given what we're seeing here, it looks like that's broader than just Germany. Effectively, hardly any product gave us a dose response to Ramularia at this site up in Scotland. The only two actives or products that we tested that had efficacy on Ramularia were those containing chlorothalonil. Bravo on the right, Traoris on the left. Traoris, I think, full label rate of Traoris contains 625 grams of chlorothalonil, and Bravo full dose contains 1,000 grams, so that probably explains why Bravo looks a little stronger than Traoris. Quite a marked change. And actually SRUC in their wisdom had the foresight to do a second trial on this topic, and this was exactly the same result as what you have here. Unfortunately, it's not in here, but it showed exactly the same pattern, so it doesn't appear to be a single trial site effect. Looking at net blotch for a moment, we have a situation in 2017 where Intrex and Vertizan looked a little bit less strong than prothioconazole, and generally it took around about a full label rate of a mixture to control net blotch within these trials, so quite high rates required. How does that compare with what we've seen previously, I think is the key question. So I've looked back, and we've on the right-hand side, you've now got, for the single active ingredient products, a combined chart for 16 and 17, and we're comparing that with the left, where we have a chart for 14 and 15. And there's quite a shift here. We can use Proline as the arbitrator or the benchmark to work from. In 2014-15, all of the SDHIs tested, we had Vertizan, Intrex, Zulu in there, were more effective than Proline. In the last 2 years, the two that we've been testing, Intrex and Vertizan, were less effective than Proline. There's clearly been a step change in sensitivity on net blotch, to the SDHIs. Interestingly, actually, before I go on, Comet, still working reasonably well there. And that may help us. We know that there has been in the past the F129L mutation in net blotch. That was always known to have a bit of a fitness penalty. So whether we haven't been using as much QOI of late and we've seen a reversion to sensitivity, that's possible. But certainly at the moment, it looks to be one active group that does seem to do to add on net blotch control. We maybe should in the future be looking at what else we should use. Perhaps Ciprodinil may be something that we should look at more in the future. The mixtures, when we compare the last 2 years and the previous two, there seems to be a change in the rate required to control net blotch, but we are at a full label rate in the last 2 years able to control it, which is reassuring. But previously we might have been able to rely on a half dose or even less to effectively keep that in check. I think the rate may need to be higher now in order to control net blotch. A little bit on mildew, and we know on the right-hand side there that the SDHIs will add to mildew control, but they in themselves aren't very strong. The Straight mildewicides, Talius and cyflamid we've been testing here, and they both have good activity on barley mildew. Cyflamid perhaps a little stronger than Talius, but reassuringly Proline itself is very active on barley mildew, and where it's used, even at a quarter or half dose in this trial, it effectively controlled mildew for us. So it's perhaps unsurprising that the two mixtures on the left-hand side, both of which contain prothioconazole, also look strong on mildew. So just to sum up on barley, actually I'll leave you to read the notes that I've got there because we've covered most of those points, but there is one last slide that I think sums up the active ingredients and categories that we have, or disease categories. And if we look at this on Rhynchosporium, we still have the azoles, the SDHIs and multisites. So there's a lot of actives out there, a lot of groups we can use and turn to control Rhynchosporium. There are concerns about strobilurins. Net blotch, the azoles are still working. The multisites don't really do much on net blotch anyway. There is insensitivity that's been detected in the UK to SDHIs, and we have this partial insensitivity in strobilurins, although at the moment, as I said, that doesn't seem to be significantly affecting its performance. On Ramularia, the situation is a little bit more bleak in that the azoles, strobilurins, and SDHIs, there are isolates out there that are insensitive to all three groups, it seems. Whether the situation on farmers is as bleak as the two trials in Scotland indicate, that remains to be seen. It's quite possible that those groups may still, there may be still some sensitivity out there. But I think if you are looking to control Ramularia, the addition of a multisite in the form of chlorothalonil would be well advised. Ideally, if we can use varietal resistance as well, that would also help. Powdery mildew, a lot of options. Azoles work, SDHIs as well. And it's not on here, but of course the straight mildewicides also have good activity there as well. So that's an easy one to keep in check. Thank you very much.